The storm came crawling over the plains like a pack of wolves with thunder in their throats, and every man in the territory knew to find shelter when the sky turned that shade of bruised purple. But Caleb Mercer did not turn his horse toward town. He turned toward the open range, because somewhere beyond the cottonwoods and the winding river a woman stood on a porch with tears in her eyes and a promise hanging between them like a noose. And her voice from that morning still echoed in his head. "You promised to stay," she had cried, her hands fisted in his coat while the wind tugged at her hair, and he had ridden away anyway, thinking he had time to fix what pride had broken. Caleb was not a man who broke his word lightly. Folks in Dry Creek said he was as steady as the iron rails pushing west, but even steady men could be fools when fear whispered in their ears, and fear had told him he would ruin her life if he stayed, that a ranch hand with scars and a past full of gun smoke had no right tying himself to a woman like Eliza Hart, whose laughter once rang through the saloon brighter than any piano. Yet when he reached the ridge and looked back at the little white house near the creek, he saw her small figure standing alone, and something inside him cracked louder than the thunder overhead. Dry Creek was the kind of town that lived between dust and hope, a single street lined with false front buildings, the saloon leaning like it had given up on standing straight, the church bell rusted but stubborn, and the mercantile run by old Mr. Jenkins, who claimed he had seen better days in Abilene. Though no one believed half his stories, Caleb had drifted into that town 2 years ago after trouble in Texas, carrying nothing but a saddle and a silence that kept most men from asking questions. And it was in that town he first saw Eliza, sleeves rolled up, arguing prices with a cattle buyer twice her size. Fire flashing in her eyes, Eliza Hart had come west with dreams bigger than the prairie. Her father had died on the trail from Missouri, leaving her the small patch of land by the creek and a stack of debts taller than a fence post. But she never once bowed her head to hardship. She planted corn where the soil allowed. She mended fences with blistered hands. And when the bank threatened to take it all, she stood on that porch and swore she would rather face a cyclone than give up. Caleb had admired her from a distance at first, then closer, until one evening under a sky painted gold, he told her he would help her hold on to that land, and she believed him. The trouble began with rumors drifting in from the rail camps. Talk of a man named Boyd Callahan who was buying up properties along the river. Men said he had money from back east, and a temper like dry tinder. Caleb knew the name, had seen it once scratched on a wanted poster near Dodge City, though the charges had been smudged by rain. When Callahan's riders first came to Dry Creek, they rode slow, smiling too easily, offering contracts thick with fine print. Eliza refused them outright, and that refusal put a target on her door. Caleb had tried to keep the danger from her. He had met Callahan's men at the edge of town, told them plain that the heartland was not for sale, and they had laughed, the kind of laugh that promised trouble later. That night, Caleb sat alone in the barn, oiling his revolver while the horses shifted uneasy in their stalls. He told himself he could handle it, that he had faced worse in the border skirmishes south of United States territory, but he also knew Callahan did not fight fair, and men who did not fight fair rarely stopped at threats. The morning the storm rolled in was the same morning Caleb decided to leave. Not forever, he told himself, just long enough to draw the danger away. He had saddled up before dawn, planning to ride west and let Callahan's men follow. But Eliza woke early, as she always did, and found him by the gate, her eyes wide with understanding that cut deeper than any blade. She stepped toward him as the first rumble shook the horizon, and she said the words that would follow him into the storm. "You promised to stay," not angry, not accusing, just wounded, as if his leaving confirmed every fear she had buried now. As rain lashed his coat and lightning split the sky open, Caleb pulled his horse to a stop in the middle of the prairie, the wind howling loud enough to drown reason. He saw in his mind the porch, the fields, the stubborn line of her jaw, and he understood that running was no kind of protection, that a promise was not something you guarded by distance but by presence. He turned the horse hard toward Dry Creek, the storm stinging his face like penance, and as he rode back into the fury, he muttered into the wind that he would keep his word, even if the heavens themselves tried to tear him from it, because some vows were worth riding through hell to honor. By the time Caleb reached the outskirts of Dry Creek, the storm had swallowed the last stripe of daylight, rain falling so hard it flattened the dust into slick black mud, and lightning carved the sky into jagged pieces. He could barely see the church steeple through the sheets of water. Yet he knew every inch of that road by heart. He leaned low over his horse's neck and pushed forward, because somewhere beyond the veil of rain was the heart place, and he would not let another minute pass with doubt between them. The town looked wrong. Doors barred, windows dark, the sign outside the saloon swinging wild in the wind. He slowed near the mercantile and spotted fresh hoofprints gouged deep into the mud. Too many for coincidence. Callahan's riders had come during the storm, counting on thunder to swallow the sound of gunfire if it came to that. Caleb's jaw tightened as he followed the tracks leading out toward the creek, anger rising steady and cold. He had tried to leave to spare her, and in doing so had opened the door to exactly what he feared. He remembered the last time he had seen Boyd Callahan in the flesh, a tall man with a gambler's smile and eyes that never softened. That meeting had been months earlier at a cattle auction near Wichita. Callahan had spoken smooth as oil about expansion and progress, about how small ranches were relics of a fading era. Caleb had said nothing then, but he saw the hunger in the man's gaze, the kind that did not care who got trampled, so long as the land changed hands. Now that hunger had turned toward Eliza's patch of stubborn green. When Caleb crested the final rise before the Hart property, his heart hammered harder than the storm. The White House stood crooked in the wind, lantern light flickering inside like a desperate signal. 3 horses were tied to the fence, and shadows moved on the porch. He slid from the saddle without a sound, boots sinking into mud, rain masking his approach. He counted shapes through the lightning flashes. 2 men by the door, 1 pacing near the barn. Callahan liked to watch rather than work, so Caleb guessed the leader was somewhere close. Savoring the pressure he applied inside the house, Eliza stood tall despite the tremor in her hands. She faced Boyd Callahan across her own kitchen table, the contract spread out between them, his hat tipped low, his voice calm as he explained that storms had a way of ruining crops and barns alike. That accidents happened when properties were left unprotected. He did not shout, he did not threaten outright. He simply described possibilities, and Eliza listened with her chin lifted. Though each crack of thunder made the windows rattle like bones, Caleb moved first for the man by the barn, a quick strike to the jaw that dropped him into the mud without a cry. Then he cut the reins of the tied horses, slapping their flanks so they bolted into the night. Chaos was his ally. Lightning flared as he climbed the porch steps. The 2 guards turning too late, he slammed one into the railing and drew his revolver on the other. The door burst open at the commotion, and in the doorway stood Callahan, rain slicking his coat, eyes narrowing with recognition. "Well now," Callahan said over the roar of wind. "The stray dog returns," his smile thin. Calculating, Caleb stepped between him and the house, water streaming down his face, and replied that some men came back when something worth fighting for was at stake. Callahan's gaze flicked past him to the open door where Eliza stood, her eyes wide, not with fear but with fierce relief. And in that instant Caleb felt the weight of his earlier mistake settle and lift all at once. He had left, yes, but he had come back before the ink could stain her future. The standoff stretched as lightning flashed again, thunder cracking so close it shook the porch boards. Callahan drew his weapon slow, confident in his skill, but the storm chose that moment to unleash a blinding burst of light that leveled the world into white. Shots rang out, swallowed by thunder. When the sound faded, Callahan's revolver lay in the mud, and his shoulder bled dark beneath torn fabric. Caleb's own arm burned from a grazing shot, yet he did not lower his aim. He told Callahan to ride out and never return, and something in his voice, steady as bedrock, convinced the man that tonight was not his night to win. So Boyd Callahan backed away into the rain, vowing that the land would cost more than bullets before this was done. Dawn did not break gentle after that storm. It clawed its way over the prairie in streaks of bruised orange, revealing fences torn down, fields flattened, and the Hart barn leaning like a tired old man. Caleb had not slept, his arm bound tight with a strip of clean cloth while he worked through the night setting boards, straight and driving nails with stubborn fury. Eliza moved beside him in the grey light, silent but steady, and every now and then their shoulders brushed, as if to make certain the other was still there. Word of the gunfire spread through Dry Creek before the mud had dried. By mid-morning, a handful of townsfolk rode out to see the damage. Old Mr. Jenkins from the mercantile, the preacher with his collar crooked, even the barkeep, wiping his hands on an apron. They took in the broken rails and the gouges in the yard, and muttered about Boyd Callahan's reach. Some suggested selling before worse came. Others looked at Caleb with something like respect. because he had stood his ground when thunder and lead filled the air. Eliza listened to them all, and then thanked them kindly. But she did not bend. She said her father had not crossed half the country from Missouri just for her, to surrender at the first sign of a bully with money. Her voice carried across the yard stronger than the wind had been. Caleb watched her and felt a swell of pride that made the ache in his arm seem small. He understood then that keeping his promise meant more than driving off one man. It meant standing beside her when the next test came, and the next test came sooner than expected. A rider approached near noon, bearing no weapon in hand, only a folded document, sealed with red wax. He claimed to be a representative of a rail company, expanding westward from Kansas City. The line they planned would cut close to the creek, increasing the value of surrounding land, and Boyd Callahan had secured preliminary agreements with most property owners along the route. The Hart parcel remained the final obstacle. Without it, the rail spur would bend elsewhere. Caleb read the document slow, lips pressing thin. The offer was large enough to clear every debt and build a finer house twice over. He handed it to Eliza without a word. She studied the numbers, her fingers tracing the ink where Callahan's name appeared as intermediary. Temptation flickered in her eyes, not from greed, but from relief. Relief at the thought of no more threats, no more storms of men at her door. Yet she lifted her gaze to the fields beyond the fence, to the soil her father had broken with his own hands. That evening, as the sun sank red behind the cottonwoods, she stood on the porch where she had once watched Caleb ride away, and she turned to him with a question that trembled softer than the first one had. She asked whether he would still stay if she chose the harder road, if keeping the land meant years of struggle against men like Callahan and companies with iron ambitions. Caleb did not hesitate this time. He stepped close enough that the last light caught in her eyes, and said he had already ridden through the worst of it, and he would ride through whatever came next. The next morning they rode into Dry Creek together, mud still thick on their boots, and marched straight into the saloon where Boyd Callahan nursed his wounded pride, along with a glass of whiskey. The room fell silent as Caleb placed the unsigned contract on the table. Eliza spoke clear and calm. She said her land was not for sale at any price that required fear to seal the deal. She told Callahan the rail could curve around her fields or not come at all, because progress that trampled promises was nothing she wished to profit from. Callahan studied them both for a long moment, calculating as always, but something had shifted. The storm had shown him that intimidation would not fracture what stood between them. He gave a slow nod and said the rail would find another path, perhaps through less stubborn soil. And though no friendship passed between them, a boundary had been drawn. When Caleb and Eliza stepped back into the sunlight, the town seemed different, not because danger had vanished, but because it had been faced together. She slipped her hand into his and whispered that he had kept his word, and he answered that some promises were not about staying in one place, but about standing firm no matter how fierce the storm. And beneath the wide western sky they began to build, not just fences and barns, but a life anchored in a vow proven by wind, rain, and unwavering return.